We're in episode 3 here. We're at day 10, resupply, and we get to laze around, eat food, which after being 10 days. And one of the things I think is kind of interesting is I watch these videos of these long distance hikers and stuff, and they don't seem to go more than 3 or 4 or 5 days before they make it into town. It's rare for them to make it 10 days without going into a town and getting something to eat and maybe getting a motel and stuff like that. Well, we'd been there 10 days, and it would be 14 more days before we left the Glacier Peak. We really left the wilderness, Glacier Peak Wilderness. So we resupplied, and then it was time to go up the valley there, and the instructor strung us out in that valley, and we did what Outward Bound refers to as a solo. So each of us would spend 3 days by ourselves there in the Glacier Peak Wilderness with just minimal supplies. We had no food. We got our own water. I think we had our poncho, and that was about it. So spent 3 days there, and it gives you time to think about stuff. And that's another thing that you don't seem to see much anymore, is people that just are spending that time. I know there's a few guys on YouTube that do week-long hikes, solo hikes by themselves. So it's really something that I think everybody needs to try from time to time. So that was another thing. I had made my little camp spot there, and it was the last day, and I was waiting for the instructor to come along, and he was going to come down the valley and make bring us all off a solo and meet up. And it was kind of neat. I was sitting there, and I turned around, and it probably wasn't 10-15 feet from me. There was a fawn curled up asleep, a deer, very young, still in its spots, and it was just laying there asleep. And I remember the instructor came up, and I went, "Be quiet," and he came up, and he kind of looked around, and that's the last I remember. I don't remember that deer getting up and leaving. I don't remember anything happening with that deer, and I don't remember the instructor saying anything about it. But again, another rather unusual occurrence. Something happened. But anyway, we went back, set camp, and we went, and I'm not real sure about the sequence here, but we went on up to the end of that valley we were in, and I believe it's Fortress Mountain is at the end. And again, climbing very steep snow slopes, planting the ice axe, kicking steps, and we finally got to the top, and once again, just spectacular North Cascade views in every direction. And it was big, puffy clouds drifting by, and I mean, they were just like drifting by like that. And blue sky, just spectacular mountain climbing day. So we made our way. We spent the night in a very buggy meadow kind of area, and then we headed on down that valley. And the instructor had talked about how he had lost he had a Swiss Army knife, and he had lost it. So we headed down that valley, and we got to where a big log was laying across the trail. And this log, everybody was going over it, but it was just high enough, so I just got down and I crawled under it. And I crawled under it, and I looked down, and there was a Swiss Army knife sitting on the ground. So I picked it up and put it in my pocket. So we went over Buck Creek Pass, and on down back into the Suiattle River Valley there, across the Suiattle, and headed up onto Glacier Peak. And that was another spectacular. It was a ridge that goes up, and I believe it kind of goes up, and you get onto the cool glacier. But there's a little shelf again that we stopped, and we had views of glaciers. And the main glacier we saw over here was Chocolate Glacier, it's called. So that night I was standing around, and I brought up the topic to the instructor about his knife, And he was going on about, you know, man, that was his Swiss Army knife. It really meant a lot to him, I said. And one of the things we had were a couple of Payday candy bars, and I knew that he had a Payday candy bar. And I'm talking along, and I said, man, that's really terrible. You lost that knife, but I bet if you could, if you could give or pay a Payday candy bar to get that knife back, I bet you would do that, wouldn't you? And he looked at me and he knew he'd been had. And so I gave him his knife back. He gave me the Payday, and we divided that one Payday candy bar. I divided that one Payday candy bar. I probably used this into 8 little pieces, and I gave everybody a piece of that Payday candy bar, which was really ambrosia after being back there in the woods, not having anything like that for now almost 2 weeks, you know. So we took off the next morning, and we got up on the glacier, and we got up to this crevasse, and that, just looking into walking on a glacier and looking into these crevasses, if you ever see pictures of that, it's just the blue ice and stuff like that. Well, we practiced crevasse rescue, and what we'd do is we'd tie that gold line around somebody's waist and drop them down, and about 50 feet down into that crevasse was a little shelf, and we'd drop people down onto that shelf. We still had them tied to that rope, and then the rest of us would work to get him out with the other lines and stuff like that. And we went round and round and got each person in practice at it. And I remember getting down in that glacier and looking around. It was something else. And I remember it wasn't, I mean, it was like almost instantaneously you were just bitter cold down in that glacier crevasse. Well, we made it on up. We made it to the summit of Glacier Peak, and we were going to bivouac the night. And so, of course, there was snow up on the summit, and I doubled that pad. I put my backpack under me. I put everything I could to insulate me from the snow. There were some little rock walls that people had constructed, and got in there to get out of the wind, and I think we maybe stretched a tarp over the top. Did the best we could, but it was still a very, very cold night. But what was spectacular was to get up and I crawled. I didn't want to crawl out of that sleeping bag, but I did, and looked at the stars, and you could see all the lights of Seattle in the distance. Just spectacular night view. Got up the next morning and broke camp and headed off down what is it, White Chuck Glacier, I think it was. And we're going down, and I'm roped up, and let's see, I think I'm the anchor. I'm there's 3 of us on a rope, and so the guy in the middle is Chip, and Chip hadn't been too good with learning stuff. You know, he'd go through the motions, but I don't think he learned much of anything. But so we're in a line coming down this steep slope, and finally we're about to get off this glacier, and I take my gloves off, and just about that time Chip falls, and he falls, and and he's in the middle, and he starts going down that hill. And he doesn't do anything. He throws his hands up in the air and goes, ah! And so he's just going down. Well, I turn around and I plant myself into the slope, and he's by then gotten enough momentum, and it just rips me off that slope. And of course I fall about 10-15 feet and land again, and now I'm mad. And I dig in hard, and I finally arrest the thing. And so I'm here. The very first guy's here, and Chip is right here. That's how. So that rope is about 100 feet, 120 feet long, probably 100 feet long, and so now I've come that distance, and so I'm even with the guy at the very front of the rope, and here's Chip hanging down there. So we get off that slope, and my knuckles are all skinned up because I took the gloves off, and that snow and ice is boogered up my knuckles. So I probably had a few words for Chip on that deal, but we make camp, next morning there's a slope there, and we spend the day rock climbing and doing rock climbing and belaying and stuff like that. And we meet up with the other patrol because our group was actually two different patrols, and they went off one way and we went another way. And so now we meet up, and half of them come over to us and half of us go over to them. So now we've broken up. We go the next day, and we traverse around and camp the night. And so it's a whole different group of people. You know, the whole group is a little bit different dynamic. So we've got new stories to hear and new stories to tell. And we camp the night. We wake up the next morning, and you can't see 10 feet in front of you. We're just all socked in with fog. And so we kind of have a little, it's kind of a little more difficult to navigate in when you can't see around you kind of what your relationship is there on the landscape. So we take off, and we finally bail out on this ridge that we're following and go down to this other river valley, and that takes us out to another road in out of the Glacier Peak Wilderness. And the next morning, the idea is to get up and kind of like run a marathon. And I don't remember how long it was, but it was probably 6 miles. I'm gonna guess at what we ran, 8 miles possibly. We just run up the trail and down, and that was the last thing. We come back. This is the last day of our course. So this is day 23 or 24. And I guess it must have been the next to the last day. I think the next morning we get up, and we're waiting for the bus to get there, and the instructor takes us each aside and talks to us, as you might say, a debriefing. And the main thing I remember about that was the instructor asked me, well, and I was one of the few people, I think, on that backpacking trip that had backpacked a good bit before. And he said, well, did you learn anything? And I go, yeah, I learned anything. He said, what'd you learn? I said, well, I think I learned that whatever I want to do and whatever I want, if I've got the patience to wait and to work at it, I'll get it. I can get whatever I want if I've got that kind of patience to do that. And looking back on that now is that's pretty much how things worked out. You know, that's pretty much how things worked out. So I went back to the bus showed up finally. We loaded up, went back into Seattle. A guy had stayed at the YMCA and said, man, they got a great little cafe breakfast going on there. So I headed over there first thing, ate a good breakfast, went back to the house, stayed with my friends that night. I can't remember, whether that was the night or the first night I'd gotten there the 24 days before, whether that was when we had a big spaghetti dinner. But anyway, then the next part of this adventure would start the next day, as I would leave the house there in the college, the university district there. And that house it's a big old house, and I looked on Google Maps, and it's still there. And so the next morning I would head out and be hitchhiking towards Vancouver, British Columbia, and we'll take it up from there.